Good morning, and welcome to October. Let's see, ought to be about, 70 days to Christmas or something like that, if I calculated correctly. Trust you're having a good day. When we were coming over the hill between here and Penns Creek and looked out over this valley, we saw more clouds on the ground than we did in the sky. And Hannah says, well, that's part of the sky. And I said, well, we usually don't think that we're walking around in the sky. So anyway, and it was especially the first stretch of 45 after turning off 104, we were in and out of a little bit of clouds. It was kind of interesting. Don't remember ever seeing it quite like that. But that has very little to do with Sunday school class, so let's go ahead and start with Sunday school class. Do you have prayer requests you'd like this group to remember as we open with prayer? All right. I think I've said this before, you probably have forgotten, but I learned quite a number of years ago that it is inappropriate to ask the wife to lead in prayer. She's not the wife, she's my wife. But I would like to ask my wife to lead us in prayer this morning, please.
Dear Father, we thank you once again for the privilege of being in your house, for being able to freely come and worship you and learn more about you from your word. Pray that you would be with Rex this morning as he teaches, function and be able to give to us that you have helped him to prepare and help us to be able to benefit from it, to go farther up the road, closer to Jesus.
Amen. Brother Stephen is going to help by collecting the offering, and I will go ahead. There's a lesson in here, and you're surely welcome to look at your edition of it. I believe it's about the Tower of Babel. Very good lesson, very important lesson. Those of you who have been in churches where they use banner or Herald and Banner curriculum, if you remember back 7 years ago to today, you'll probably remember the lesson. Since we're in a senior class, that might be easier to remember than last week's lesson. Or maybe it was 10 times 7 years ago. I think they have a 7-year cycle, don't they, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe you remember best 10 times 70 years ago. I really remember that when I was a negative 3 years old at that time. But that's what I'm going to do with it. Our other teachers do such an amazing job of developing the lessons and usually verse by verse and hitting all that's in there. So I just go all over the place. And this is installment 2 of what I never learned in church. And some of it even relates to Genesis. And a lot of it relates to the Old Testament, of which Genesis is a part. So let's go and thank the Lord that technology seems to remember from 3 weeks ago when I did this, and not having to fumble around to try to get the stuff to get it to work this time. Adam to Jacob. In the quarterly, remember was the map, and we focused on the map and different things about the map last time I taught. But there's also a chart about the ages of the patriarchs from Adam to Jacob. And I just took a picture of that and showed it here. I had actually drawn one out like this myself. I didn't learn it in church, but I just did it on my own and discovered something along this line. But it's interesting that if you just take this as face value, as we have here, and see the overlapping of the lives of these patriarchs, if you just read it in Genesis, 5 or something like that, where it has a number of these, and then maybe again and a little later on for the later ones. You probably don't catch on to how they would have overlapped by the longevity of different lives. But if you drop a vertical line down from the end of Adam's life, 930, you'll see that he overlapped all of his descendants to Lamech. Lamech, he didn't live very long because he died before the flood, no doubt was a godly man and died before the flood, so he didn't have to go through that or be on the ark. He only lived through his grandsons, but then his grandson lived a long, long, long time, and in fact, that means that Adam no doubt knew Lamech. That was before the dispersion of the worlds, of the races or the peoples. So he probably knew his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson Lamech. Lamech would have surely known his grandson Shem, and at least possibly Shem could have known Jacob, his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson. Actually, according to that chart and those lifespans that the Bible recounts to us, Shem would have outlived Abraham, his 7-time great-grandson. I don't anticipate rivaling Shem's record, and I don't think I want to, actually. I wouldn't mind seeing a great-grandson or grandchild someday, hopefully a few years out still, but I don't think I want to see 7 greats worth, which are actually then, 9 generations, I think, or 8 generations, because you got to have a grandson in between, so I don't want to see that. Some people wonder how in the world Moses could have known anything about creation. Well, one could have been direct divine revelation, but it could also very well have been oral transmission from one person to another. And you can see just on this chart that we're viewing, to get clear from the beginning, Adam, to Jacob, that would only be 3 links. So no great problem if indeed the Spirit chose to use in part that oral transmission of the story of creation on down then from Jacob to Moses. Wouldn't have been that far. Probably farther than this. But Noah's Ark. See, I told you it had something to do with Genesis. You all know about Noah's Ark, right? By the way, I am a direct descendant of Noah. And by the way, we're also all related, at least back there. So I have on my study wall a framed photograph of the ark. And you've probably seen a similar one. Isn't that kind of what we see most often? A nice little boat about so big and so tall and all of that. Well, if you read the Bible carefully and pay attention to numbers, not everybody's a number person, but if you should pay attention to the number, you will discover that my camera took a bit distorted, or rather, not my camera, this picture that came down to me from my well, I won't get all the greats, but back to Noah, from that grandfather, it was a little bit distorted. That was early in technology, so it didn't quite take it exactly right. The proportions would have been more like this. It's long, wide, high, but long. 10 times as long as it is high. Now, whether it was the old Egyptian Babylonian cubit of 20.5 inches about, or one of the other cubits more like 1.5 feet, The exact dimensions might vary a little bit. This one goes with the longer dimensions and makes it a very long boat. But one way or the other, it wasn't that boxy little thing that could sit on your shelf easily. For some type of comparison, you can see there, it was a big boat. And they've calculated cubic capacity. I didn't bring all of that in because this wasn't my major focus, but it was just something. I think I actually drew out one of these as well to get that scale. So those were a couple of things I didn't learn in church, but I did figure out before I got to seminary on those. They calculated the number of rail box cars that would capacity and all of that. Somebody just asked me recently about, I think it was in reading maybe the quarterly or something or other, a previous lesson about Noah that said something about, they'd done a lot of the guys in Noah's family had spent a lot of their year and however many days in the ark shoveling food in and then shoveling other stuff that's post-food, processed food, out. They took food on, so there must have been some feeding. A lot of possibilities there. God might have caused most of the animals to hibernate, kind of, so they might not have been as active as we often think. Remember when it says two of every kind, that doesn't mean two of every species such as we know them today. So two dog kind would have been enough so that all of the dog varieties that would descend from that. Anyway, but still, big boat, amazing miracle, demonstrating the power of God in so many ways. But I think I might have to go home and take that picture down off the wall and send a message to many great grandpa Noah or Shem, or Japheth probably, that he didn't quite get it right in the picture he gave me. Building an ark, he did it fine. They did it fine. Okay, another area that has been one of the, I learned this one earlier, maybe kind of through church, because I think they introduced me, or one way I found about a layman study curriculum on the Hebrew poetry. So I did pick this up earlier, maybe even before Bible college. You may know it, but if not, it was one of the first things I learned that really transformed my understanding and the way I read the Bible. So if you know it, great. If you don't, I hope it will be helpful and will maybe even change the way you read the Bible, the poetic parts of the Bible. Hebrew poetry is not found just in what we call the poetical books, Job through Song of Solomon. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. The first instance of Hebrew poetry in the Bible is in Genesis 4. So I'm still in Genesis and doing a good job, sticking with the quarterly, where Lamech, not the Lamech that's the grandson of, or the grandfather of Shem, but an earlier Lamech, married the first recorded instance of bigamy, at least, if not polygamy. He had some issues. He was of the line of Cain, I believe. And he said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. That's an interesting study in itself, but here we're focusing on the poetry. Now, if you just read that in some of your King James Bibles, that didn't show poetry by any stylistic means, by how they aligned the lines, indenting as I have them here. You very likely could not catch on to the fact that that was poetry. I mentioned that, to my thinking, one of the advantages of the King James is that I don't think I mentioned that last time, but maybe I did. But it distinguishes between the these and the thous and the ye's and the yao. I mean, you, those sort of things. And that if you know about it, that helps you know whether the person speaking is speaking to one you or multiple you plural, y'all, okay. Youans, yous, that gets into a different story. But so that's an advantage of the King James and a few of the older revisions. One advantage of some of the newer versions and Bibles is that most of them do in fact print poetry in a poetic form. So you can just flip through your Bible. I was looking through this one to see if it happened to have it, and it's a King James, and it doesn't have poetry written as poetry in the form of poetry, indentation of lines and so forth. So you can visually see it. Some of the other versions do, so that might be an advantage to using them. You can more easily identify if you're dealing with Hebrew poetry. Of course, the best thing is to learn Hebrew, and then you can tell easily. Maybe by next week you can show me in your Hebrew Bible and help me see it. So that's in Genesis. We already have poetry. And in fact, poetry is found all throughout the Old Testament. It's very prominent in the prophets. Isaiah, chapters after chapters of poetry in Isaiah and Jeremiah. Some of the prophets are almost entirely, the minor prophets especially, entirely poetry. In fact, if I remember correctly, about a third of the Old Testament is actually poetry. So poetry is pretty important in the Bible, in the Old Testament particularly. What makes Hebrew poetry poetry? Well, what makes English poetry poetry? There are a lot of things, and of course not all English poetry is created equal. Some of it is very unequal. But at least as we commonly think of it, some characteristics that distinguish it from prose are meter or rhythm. You know, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Or you can change that around and say da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Or you can say da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But that has some kind of rhythm of the accented and unaccented syllables. Rhyme. Last word of the line rhymes with some other word, and there are different patterns there. It can be every other 2 lines or every other line or all sorts of different varieties, but some kind of rhyme. And then, of course, the vivid language, the figurative language, often concrete language. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over something, many quaint and something volume of forgotten lore, suddenly I heard a tapping and a rapping and nevermore, which is where I need to go with that poem, nevermore. But rhythm and rhyme. Hebrew poetry, well, it definitely uses vivid, figurative, concrete language. In fact, even in its prose, it's sometimes a lot more concrete and vivid language. It had a smaller vocabulary, for one thing, and it uses it, but it's very, very earthy, almost tangible type language. But rhyme and rhythm, basically no. Now, if you're reading Hebrew and you're really good at it, you can probably pick up some type of rhythm or meter, but it's not that easily discernible fixed rhythm of ours, da 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 type of thing. Which means, since it doesn't rely on rhythm and rhyme, it's highly translatable. One of the hardest things to do, just learn another foreign language and then compare the hymn books, 2 songs in the hymn books, and when that language also uses poetry that's based on rhyme, almost always there's pretty significant adjustment. They get the basic meaning, but they can't stay too close because corazón doesn't rhyme with mart or smart. Well, heart does, but corazón in Spanish doesn't work. That's why Cristo me ama is not Jesus loves me, it's Cristo me ama to fit the rhythm and the rhyme. Hebrew poetry, you don't have to worry about that because it's not based primarily on rhythm and rhyme. So what does make Hebrew poetry poetry? Well, probably the main, I hedged a bit and said a main characteristic is what has come to be called parallelism. Often that's couplets, 2 lines in a part of a poem, sometimes more than 2, but probably most commonly couplets. And the second line in some way parallels, some thought way parallels the first line. So we saw it in the example from Genesis. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Ye wives of Lamech, that's who Ada and Zillah were, hearken to my speech. The same basic idea, different words, different ways of saying it, but parallel. And that characteristic, this is what really made the difference in the way I read the poetry parts of the Old Testament. Again, if you weren't familiar with this before, read a few Psalms this week and look for this sort of thing. Now, the Hebrew writers, the biblical writers, probably didn't have any idea that they were writing parallelism. At least they probably didn't use that term. Number one, it's not from Hebrew. It's from Greek, but the word comes from Greek, I believe. But so they wouldn't have called it that, and they probably didn't even sit down and analyze it. They just grew up in an environment where this was so common that they even thought sometimes in that way. So you'll find poems where people are just kind of talking to each other, and you'll say, who would ever do that? How do you compose a poem right on the spot? Well, possibly, at least, they were just so, it was so much a part of who they were that they thought that way, and they could just spout out this poetry. Might be a little easier because they didn't have to think whether it rhymed or not. So these are terms and analyses that scholars across the years have applied. Maybe somewhat artificial, and you'll find different scholars, of course, saying different things, but still, I think, very helpful. And probably the most common is what has come to be called by many synonymous parallelism. That's, as the name implies, where the second line says about the same thing as the first line. It's about synonymous. And so the example we just saw is indeed synonymous parallelism. If you think about it, those 2 lines are saying almost exactly the same thing, just with different words. Another very well-known one. The heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, night unto night showeth knowledge, from Psalm 19. Now you might say, wait a minute, day and night, that's not synonymous. Yeah, kind of, you're right. But I think what he's doing is throwing an extra poetical strategy in there by saying day unto day. That is kind of parallel, not exactly synonymous, but definitely parallel with night unto night. And by getting day unto day and night unto night, he's saying all the time, as the previous said, all creation shows this glory of God. Synonymous parallelism. Antithetic parallelism is about the opposite of that. And it's very common, it's again in different places in the Bible, but very common in Proverbs. That's where the second line, instead of saying the same thing as the first line, contrasts the first. And very often it helps us figure that out because it puts a but in there. Excuse me. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. notice also that in this parallelism, whether it's synonymous, saying basically the same thing, or here saying the opposite, there are other little nuances that can come through where the parallelism can actually help us understand a little bit the meaning. So here, notice that the Lord knowing is contrasted with shall perish. So that tells us that really, if God doesn't know us by our knowing God today through the gospel, that's equivalent to perishing. I mean, if you don't know God, hang it up. That's all there is, really, to life. Hatred stirreth up strifes, but love covereth all sins. So, antithetic. A third type that's actually a special case of synonymous, you can say the same thing by using an emblem or a symbol or figurative language. So some have called it emblematic parallelism. That's where one line expresses the idea of the couplet, which would be similar in both lines. So one kind of says it flat out, but the other one expresses it through a simile, using like or as, or a metaphor where you make the comparison without saying like or as. So like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him. The Father is used here as a simile for the role of the Lord. As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. God is not a deer. That's good this season of the year, or we'd have a lot of people going out trying to kill him. But he'd be safe from me. But the deer that's being chased by those hunters and trying to get away, whether they're human hunters or other animal hunters, and he's been running for all he can, and he's totally exhausted and totally thirsty. He's longing, searching for water, because if he doesn't get it, he's in bad shape. That's an emblem, a symbol, an illustration of how our heart should be after the Lord. And if we realize that not knowing him is the same as perishing, then that's a good motive for seeking him, panting after him, as the hart pants after the water brooks. So emblematic. Synthetic. You know, synthesis is putting stuff together. So this one, it's actually in one sense kind of a catch-all for all the it's kind of parallel, but it doesn't fit any of those others, so just stuff it in the synthetic category. But that's where the second line in some way moves beyond, adds something new, and yet it's so connected with the first line that it is legitimate to, at least for us who want to try to get nice categories to put things in, it's legitimate to call it parallel. So it may add to, develop, complete, vary. It adds something to the first, but not in the same way that you could almost guess it by reading the first. Synonymous, you know the second line's going to be something that says the same thing. This will add something to it. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. Now you could argue this is synonymous, and delighting in the law of the Lord means meditating day and night. Or you could say, well, delight is one thing, meditating, that's a little new idea that's added in there from Psalm 1:2. I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. Connected, but it adds some more information that we wouldn't have had been able to guess just from the first line. And notice that's from Deuteronomy, so we're not in Genesis, but back in the Pentateuch. Poetry is all through the Old Testament. Now, When I taught this in hermeneutics class at Penn View, I think I added about 3 other types of parallelism that I think were helpful, but this is probably enough. More might be confusing in this context. But if you just read this week a few Psalms, a few Proverbs, or find in if you have a Bible that shows poetry, go to the prophets, wherever, and look for some of these parallel thought patterns. And the more you do it, the more you start looking for it or seeing it kind of almost automatically. And as I say, this was one of the earlier things. I think I was probably still in high school when I got at least a hint of this. The basic, pretty much what I've given you today. And it just enriched so much the way that I read the Old Testament poetry. But why does it make a difference? Well, let's see if we can sense just a bit of the power of Hebrew parallelism. Here's a passage from Numbers 23. It's Balaam is supposed to be cursing Israel, and Balak, I think Moabite king, wasn't it, has hired him to do that. And he's pretty upset with him because Balaam says, well, I can't, because God won't let me, but he still wants the money apparently, so he goes back to the Lord, and that's a whole interesting study, and I don't have all the answers to that, but God tells him to go, even though earlier he told him not to. Anyway, he gets there, and he ends up blessing the Israelites instead of cursing them. And Balak says, well, try again. So he goes over another place and builds 7 more altars and offers sacrifices and has to bless them again because God isn't going to curse them. And the third time, and he ends up not getting his money after all. But I think this is from after his third, or maybe part of his third oracle. And Balak's been on his case. I'm paying you, or planning to pay you, to curse these people. And so Balaam finally says, how shall I curse whom God hath not cursed? For from the top of the rocks I see him. That's literally, he was up high overlooking the Israelites camped in the valley there. Lo, I see him. Lo, the people that shall dwell alone. Speaking of Israel. Who can count the dust of Jacob? They're going to multiply, not cursing and reducing them. And finally he concludes, well, if that's how God's going to bless them, let me die the death of the righteous. Now I say this is from Numbers. It is from Numbers 23, 8 through 10, but it's not the whole oracle. It's really only half of it. It's the first line of each of the couplets. How shall I curse whom God hath not cursed? For from the top of the rocks I see him. Lo, the people shall dwell alone. Who can count the dust of Jacob? Let me die the death of the righteous. But the way Balaam really said it was, how shall I curse whom God hath not cursed? Or how shall I defy whom God hath not defied? For from the top of the rocks I see him, and from the hills I behold him. Lo, the people shall dwell alone, and shall not be reckoned among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, and the number of the 4th part of Israel? Let me die the death of the righteous, and let my last end be like his. If you compare this with just the first of each of those line of each of those couplets, isn't it true that the basic information is the same? You didn't really lose anything essential when I cut out the second lines. But what about the impact when you duplicate each of those lines, saying them in a little different way, focusing more attention on each thought? I think it just more than doubles the impact when this Hebrew poetry with its parallelism is used and comes through. The human writers were good writers, the biblical writers. And of course, the Holy Spirit is the best writer who worked through those human authors. One more thing that I wanted to briefly mention about Hebrew poetry, and that's alphabetic acrostics. You know what an acrostic is, don't you? First letter of each line spells something. Forsaking all, I take him. Some use that as an acrostic explaining faith. Because F-A-I-T-H, first letter of each, here not each line, each word put together spells faith. You can use acrostics for all sorts of things. It's not quite the same as an acronym, because acronyms usually aren't real words. But I used an acrostic years ago, probably 60 or more, to learn how to spell arithmetic. Because a rat in the house might eat Tom's ice cream. A rat in the house, A-R-I-T-H, might eat Tom's ice cream. I also learned the order of the planets in the solar system. Martha visits every Monday and just stays until noon. And I used to have to put a period on the end. Now I don't have to do that because Pluto's been demoted. That also gets the asteroid belt that is between Mars and Jupiter, and just stays until noon. So acrostics are really powerful things. That doesn't have a whole lot to do with Genesis or any of the rest of the Bible, except it's an illustration of acrostics. But Hebrew tends to use alphabetic acrostics. I don't know that there are any of those type of acrostics I've just mentioned. And that's where each line of a work, a poem, begins with the successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Hebrew has 22 letters, so it'd be 22 lines, and the first line starts with Aleph, and the second line starts with Beit, and the third line starts with Gimel, and so forth, down through Tav. And by the way, if it's Hebrew you're dealing with, Jesus is the Aleph and Tav, not the Alpha and Omega. Oh, but if you're doing English, he's the A and the Z. And in all three languages, it means he's just all of it. He's everything. This part of Hebrew poetry doesn't come across in translation. So go ahead and sign up to learn Hebrew. I'm sure Professor Paulus would be glad to teach you. You just have to find out from commentators or some other way if a particular passage is an acrostic. And there are a few Psalms. Actually, I think 3 or 4 of the chapters of Lamentations are acrostics, maybe 3 of them. Proverbs 31, 10 through 31, what's that about? Well, if you don't know, wait until May of next year and you may find out, may be reminded. But Psalm 119 is probably the most famous, and it is not each line or each verse, it is blocks of 8 verses that each verse starts with that respective letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So if you've noticed when you turn to Psalm 119, at the top of each group of 8 verses, there's a word there, and you may have, at least at some point in your life, had no idea what it was about. But if you want to learn the Hebrew alphabet, just read those words, and you will have the names of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. There are 8 verses for each letter. There are 22 letters in the alphabet. That makes 176, and guess how many verses there are in Psalm 119? You're right. So that explains those strange headings. Well, random fact. The Old Testament has 929 chapters in it,